Welcome to this webinar, which is titled Metaprograms, Routines Our Minds Use to Engage with Our World. It's brought to you by the APM People Interest Network and the Association for NLP. So I wanted to just give you an idea of what we will be looking at through the program. So here is a running order. First of all, we're going to meet the panel in a moment. Then we'll talk about what metaprograms are and how we unconsciously use them. Also, when we can consciously use the metaprograms in our workplace and looking at some that might help us in a project environment. Then we'll be finding out some of your metaprograms through the Menti poll that Maya has mentioned. And then after that, we'll be talking to Shelley Rose Charvet, who is one of the leading thinkers and writers in the area of metaprograms, and finding out how she uses them through what's called the lab profile, which is a technique that she has developed and written about over many years. And then finally, we'll show you where to find out a bit more about metaprograms and how to get hold of our panel today. So, let's just move straight into looking at our panel. This is who we have with us today. There are three people. Shelley Rose Charvet on the left on your screen is a recording that we have made with Shelley. She lives in Canada and the time differences make it difficult to do this live. Shelley has written about NLP and lab profile and metaprograms for many, many years. We have Mark Deacon from Entreplio. Mark's joining us from France today. Mark's got a background in retail, food manufacturing, and also is a psychologist and works in the area of NLP and making people's business work better through NLP. Sophie Vyse joins us, I think, from the UK, and Sophie's a business coach who's got a background, amongst other things, in Agile and working with tech giants like Google and Marks and Spencer's and various others. So we have a good panel today, and they know a lot about their subject, far more than I do, but nevertheless, we'll do our best to explain as much as we can about that program. So the first session then is to explain a little bit about what metaprograms are and how to use them. So first of all, let me just set the scene, and then we'll join Sophie and Mark. So we're all different, all of us, and there are many, many good reasons for that. Too many for a 1-hour webinar, really. But today we'll be looking at one of the systems of preferences or filters that works mostly below the level of our consciousness, but which help to make us all unique and who we are, and crucially, that affect the way that we behave. They're called metaprograms, and why are they called metaprograms? Well, because if they're instructions, in a sense, that run as conscious routines that we use to make ourselves heard, understood, and so on in the world, then metaprograms are outside of that. So they sit above or below or away from or different from the programs themselves. So that's why they're called meta-programs. So let's see if we can make some sense of this. Let's welcome Sophie Vyse and Mark Deacon. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Let us, first of all, as a simple sort of starter question, Sophie, if I can ask you, what exactly, I've kind of alluded to what they look like and what they are, but what really are metaprograms in our sense?
Yeah, so our brains run automatic programs and defaults, and there's all this data, and we're bombarded with data, and actually our brains have to filter it because they need that efficiency. So we have these unconscious patterns, and it's really about where our attention is drawn. And so you might ask, do I pay attention to detail, or perhaps more that helicopter view, because I get bored with detail maybe. And those are some meta programs, so there's the general and the specific. Would you like to take action straight away, or maybe reflect a little bit? That's your proactive and your reflective. So these are almost like habits that we have, so that our brains can be more efficient and we can deal with the overload of information. And we may not be aware that that sort of filtering is going on.
I think you've just described just about everybody I've ever met. But there you go. Mark, if I can come to you, just to ask you the question, Sophie's explained roughly what they are, where they sit in our consciousness and below our consciousness, and how they affect how we operate.
Well, as Sophie said, they are unconscious, so we're not aware of them most of the time. In fact, most people aren't aware of the programs that are running in the background anyway. But they directionalize where our attention is focused, what we pay attention and what we notice. And just to back up what Sophie said, if we didn't have that operating, we would just be in overwhelm. There'd be just so much information coming in, we wouldn't be able to make sense of the world. So we all have metaprograms. They're all running. They run differently for different people. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But they help us navigate through our world.
Okay, so without them, we'd be kind of lost and adrift on a sea of too much sensory input, I suppose, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Let's look at some of the main metaprograms, then, the patterns, as we call them. So taking the first one, Sophie, if I can come to you on this, proactive, reactive, this is a spectrum. Tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, so proactive people tend to initiate action. So you might see that as a project manager, that you like to just get stuck in and take that action, or perhaps even being more reactive. So I like to analyse first and then maybe even follow the lead a little bit as well. And maybe the proactive types have got that sort of fidgety, let's get on with it kind of sense. And the reactive might just be a little bit more still and reflective and like to ponder.
Okay, so if I'm a proactive person, I jump in with 2 feet, sort of thing.
Potentially, yeah. And of course, it is a spectrum, so you could be somewhere along that. It could sometimes be both because it's context specific as well. So.
And I've also come across people, certainly in a project environment, who like to sit down and work out all the possible options of steps and so on before they actually commit to doing anything. And I've worked with a lot of people like that, been like that myself sometimes. Sophie, just to stay with you for a second then, there's another pattern which we refer to as towards away from. Could you just briefly explain what this is and how this might affect people in a project environment perhaps?
Yeah, so the towards and the away from. So you might ask yourself the question, why did you leave your last job? And if your answer's more along the lines of, well, I wanted to achieve this, then it might be that you're more focused on goals, you're towards, you're motivated by that achievement. Or at the away from is more of a focus on the problems to be avoided. So maybe the things that you're concerned about and the things that you want to avoid. So, you know, when we go through the risks, we are really thinking about what might go wrong, and that's the away from. We don't want that to happen.
Okay, Mark, if I can come to you for the next one. There's a pattern which is known normally as internal-external. What's happening here?
So this is where our main driving force comes from. So some people are more internally validated. In other words, they have a felt sense of how they are themselves. Passion's a felt sense. They probably have a strong cause that they're aligned to. They understand their purpose and things really matter to them, and they validate themselves by knowing what's important and how they're getting on in the world. So they know when they've done a good job. People who are more externally referenced, they will get validation from other people. So this may be, for instance, in terms of what reward am I getting for the work that I'm putting in. They may also be validated by what do I need to do to stay away from something that I don't like so much, so avoiding something. So people who are externally referenced are using the outside world to let them know how they're doing in their navigation.
And I suppose it's important to say that this is a spectrum, so that there might be people at one extreme end and at the other extreme end. But of course, most of us will probably live somewhere along the continuum between internal and external. And of course, it's contextual, I suppose. So
very much so.
So you might be external.
Both contextual, and also we move about within these continuums. We're not completely fixed in one area, but we will have preferences where we more naturally sit.
And of course, it's important to say that these are spectrums which we live along somewhere. There's no good, there's no bad. It's just a spectrum. You might be one way, you might be another way, as Mark says, in different contexts. So there's no good or bad about this. Just moving to the next one, though. This is an interesting one: options and procedures. Sophie, what's happening here?
Yeah, so if I ask a question like, why did you choose your present job? And if your answer might be a bit more around sort of choices and criteria, so generating lots of ideas and options can be quite creative, lots of alternatives. And more procedural is sort of following those logical flows and liking to have processes documented. And perhaps in that sense, you might sort of tell the story, and, in 2017 I this and that. So, yeah. That's the options and the procedures.
And of course, all of these are found in various times and various phases of projects. So it's quite interesting that one, and as we'll be seeing when we talk to Shelley later on, in certain times in a project, you might be in the early stages looking at options for how you're going to deliver your deliverables. And then by the time you've chosen the way you're going to do it, then you literally have to follow the procedures towards the end. But of course, that doesn't mean to say that as projects have a habit of doing, something goes wrong and you have to think about how you're going to deal with it. And then you have to bring in the options again, I guess, to deal with that. So, Mark, general or big picture and specific or detail. This is a really interesting one for project folk, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. So this is how we prefer to take in information in terms of the chunk size. So it's like data preferences. So a person who's got more of a propensity towards the general big picture is naturally more attracted to top line information. Summary is where they're going to be drawn to, overall, and not so much detail. And then somebody who's down maybe the other end, more in specific and in detail, is going to be more naturally attracted to want lots more information. They're going to get down much more into the weeds, as it were, in terms of the information that they require. So you hear it in people's language, like people who want the detail, they're going to ask questions like, well, how many and where and what and how are we going to do it? They're going to want the specifics. Whereas somebody who's more global in their approach is not going to be necessarily so interested in that. They're more interested in the overall big picture.
I can just imagine probably half our audience going, that's me, you're talking about me. But of course, as we've said earlier, it changes depending on your situation and what you're doing at the time. So general and specific is very interesting. I'm guessing that there would be, in a project context, you might expect to find someone who is perhaps a program manager who's looking after a portfolio of projects, might be perhaps more big picture because they've got quite a wide spectrum of things to deal with, whereas someone who's working at the lower level, perhaps an engineer, a software engineer, whatever it is you're doing, you might be looking at more detail and not necessarily having the larger picture. So we can see all of these have some real relevance in the project environment. Let me move to the next pattern, which is sometimes called a match and mismatch, but sometimes it's all known as sameness and difference. Sophie, tell us about this one.
Yeah, so thinking about match and mismatch, you might ask the question, what's the relationship between your work this year and last year? And if you're a matching sameness person, you might sort of notice the points of similarity and draw those out and make the connections. And in the mismatch sense, you might notice the differences. And I think sometimes the mismatch can almost come across as quite sort of negative, or it can sound like that because it's the sort of what about this and have we thought about that? But actually it's so helpful, particularly say in a review type situation, you want to hear those differences. And I think in the same sense, you've got the sameness and the difference. Some people just thrive on change and they want things to be different, and some people want things to stay the same. And again, those are both such useful attributes. There's no right or wrong, but it's just maybe about recognizing what people need.
I think this one's quite relevant in the framework of change management, isn't it, as you have been saying?
Yeah.
So let us look at a very, very interesting one. Mark, I'm going to ask you about this one, in time and through time. Phrases that you wouldn't necessarily know what they mean, but could you explain this?
Yeah, I'll just give an example to start off with, and for the audience, just how do you get involved, say, with watching a film? You know, you may find yourself so really absorbed right in it that as if you're in the film itself, or you may watch it from a distance and may have noticed things that go, well, I don't know if that's technically quite right. So in time, are people who are very much live their life in the moment, in the here and now. And they are really connected with what's happening right at this point in time. And we would call that associated. They're very associated into what's going on. They can get very engrossed into things. They may even lose track of time. And sometimes they might not necessarily be the best timekeepers because it's not on their radar. On the other hand, people who are through time, their relationship is more dissociated. They tend to be the planners. They tend to be the people who maybe worry about things or considering things because they look at, well, what if this happens and what's the outcome from that? Potentially, they're quite good timekeepers. They stick to plans potentially, but not always, because there's not all these meta-programs work independently. They're quite often working together, so we can talk about that a little bit later. Think things through, and they may deal more with the factual stuff and be less emotionally connected to what's actually happened, be able to sort of distance themselves and just look at it from a slightly off-center position where they're just looking at the facts. So that's how I would describe in time and through time.
And very, very relevant here for folks in the project scenarios that we have in our audience, because of course a program plan is very much, if you look at a program plan, it's usually a screen or a piece of paper, and you're almost forced to be through time when you're looking at that, aren't you? So you're not able to kind of see time coming towards you and behind you. When you're looking at a plan, it's very much a through time thing. So I'm guessing that the planners or people who work in planning who are in our audience today will kind of get this, whereas people who are wrestling with a knotty problem in the project technical side will be more in time because they're having to deal with what happens when I do this and the next thing that happens and so on. They're very, very relevant for our people in projects. Now we're going to look at another set of patterns which are not quite the same as this in the sense that they're not on a continuous spectrum. But if I change the slide and show you what we're going to talk about now is convincer patterns. Sophie, let us just explore some of these, if we may. So these are the principal channels that the person uses to become convinced of something. I'll just pop them on the screen here, and perhaps you could talk us through how these work in our understanding.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I think just to sort of draw out that all of these meta-programs and convincer patterns are so powerful, because when we recognise maybe that we have preferences in certain situations, then we actually have more choices. We can be more agile because we can say, is this working for me? Am I overusing one particular meta-program? Could I switch? But also recognising them in other people and saying, I have different choices with then how I deal with people, because, so for example, there might be somebody who's convinced visually, and if you realise that that person is convinced visually, then you can think, actually, maybe I could show them some graphs and some charts and do some demos and show them some diagrams, and that's really going to appeal to them. And they'll see, they might say things like, I see what you mean, and can you show me? So you'll get some clues about what might convince them. There might be people who really want to hear it, and they might say things like, that sounds about right, tell me more. And so for those people, you can give verbal explanations, maybe testimonials, and tell stories, and maybe they like podcasts. So it's just about actually what are some of the ideas for these kind of people that want to read the evidence. So they might want documents and reports and papers. They might say, can you send me the details and I'll have a look at them. And there might be people who really need to do it to be convinced. And those are the people where you might sort of do a bit more hands-on workshops. You might give them a trial period for something and do some practical experiments. And they really want to have a go. And and we're often several of these. I can see for myself that I'm a combination. But also, you don't want to give too much of one of these to someone that's one of the other types. You can actually just give them what they need. And in terms of change, then you're really going to accelerate your change and get them on board, get that buy-in.
And that's really relevant because, of course, a thing you hear an awful lot these days is what does good look like? And of course, if you're a person who needs to be told things by colleagues, by peers, and so on, then good doesn't really look like anything at all. It's what it sounds like to you, perhaps, and so on. Okay, so we've got these four main channels, and I think there are others, but these are the four main ones that people have hardwired almost into them to be convinced of something. But whichever of them you happen to have as a primary one, there is a way in which they impact upon you. Mark, tell us a bit about the modes that these convincer channels work at.
Okay, so there's only a very, very small percentage of the population that is convinced by a single incident or something happening. That's down into single digits. There is also a fewer people who are automatic convincers, although there are a slightly larger number in that group. There are people who would just get it once and they just take it for gospel. Yep, that must be right. I'm quite happy to go with it. The interesting one, I think, in terms of project management is consistent, because there's a number of things that fall into that. There's people who are either a number of times convincers, multiple times, or even every time convincers, and they will be looking for repetition to build their being convinced. So when we're talking about consistency, it's the messages being linked together, being repeated, but being the same, so that they build up their level of being convinced. And then the final one on the slide is period of time, is that some people need to be hearing a message over a period of time in order for them to accept that that has convinced them that this is the new way. So in change management, this is also really highly valuable information to know about.
Yes, and I certainly agree totally with what you say about consistency, because this is often you find that the authenticity of a message is the one that utilizes a consistent message that people get, oh yeah, you said that last time, yeah, I see what you mean, and so on. So all of them combined will help to convince someone, whatever their pattern is, that the mode in which you use it and the way in which you use it will help people to form their opinions, to make their decisions, and so on. Okay, so just thinking about this for a moment before we ask our audience for their views about how they like to work, but just thinking about where metaprograms come from and how we get them and so on. Sophie, can I ask you, do metaprograms for most people change over time, or do you tend to sort of stay the same?
So they are very changeable potentially, and you might notice that you are different in different contexts. But there's an element of nature and nurture with metaprograms, so they're context specific, but also, we in different situations. So sometimes I'm absolutely bang on time, and sometimes my friends know that I almost need to relax, and at other times, and I might not be quite so on time. And so we have that full spectrum, but it's just so powerful when we bring it into awareness, and we know then that we've got that agility and we can recognise what's important in different situations.
And then, Mark, just picking up that point, knowing a little bit more, perhaps at the end of this webinar, if we're lucky, about how metaprograms work and what they do and so on. It's important, isn't it, that we could, if we have a better understanding of metaprograms, of how to change ourselves and use them to our advantage, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that what's really important here is when they are unconscious and people are not aware of them, then they are blissfully, as I would say, ignorant of what's going on. When you start raising your awareness to which patterns may I be operating and where may I be with them, then you're creating choice for yourself. And as a leader and working within the project environment, you then can start to see other people's patterns a lot easier, and that gives you the opportunity to be more flexible, and therefore bringing teams together, reducing friction, getting agreements, all become just a little bit easier, because as a leader we're starting to understand we're all different and nothing's right and nothing's wrong.
Excellent. So at this point, just in summary then, metaprograms are systematic, they happen. They're habitual, from what we've just been saying. A lot of them are under the level of consciousness. They're often on a scale, so they're not binary, they're not one and or the other. You can be somewhere along the scale. They don't always help us out. Sometimes they can be our worst enemy, but a lot of the time they're not. They're contextual, so they follow what we're doing, as we will find out. They filter our experience. And our experience of what we're doing and what we want to do. They can help to minimize conflict, as Mark's just been saying. They can help us to build rapport, as we've been looking at with some of the convincer patterns and so on. And they can certainly help with job fit, fitting people to the right jobs, as we'll see in a bit more detail when we talk to Shelley. That's using the lab profile or Entrepreneur's tools, which we'll find out a bit more about later on. So now it's time to just quickly ask our audience. So I think, Maya, you take control at this point to ask, put the questions on screen so that people can use their mobile devices to vote for where they think they are on this. So you can see on screen the code to use, a QR code. So if you point your device, phone or whatever at this, it will take you to the Menti site. I'm going to have to be quite quick on this because we have 6 questions and we want to get them done fairly quickly. So you will be asked a question which is has an A-B answer. So although we've just been saying there's a spectrum, you could be anywhere on the spectrum. Let's just go with which is your personal preference. So question 1 is, and this is for you to answer in our audience, when I work, do I prefer to act as soon as possible or wait and gather facts first? So we're starting to see a picture build up there. We're getting a lot more people who are waiters to see what happens. So that's building up there nicely. I'll move on to question 2. We have to be fairly quick on this one. So question 2 is, in general, I prefer to move towards a goal or away from a problem. So please vote with your phone now. Okay, so we're getting looks like a large proportion of people are towards goals. That's quite interesting. I'll move to question 3, and that is, I know I've done a good job when, what is it? Do I know, is it because I internally just know that I've done a good job, or is it when I get good positive feedback from others? A bit more of an even split there. Quite interesting, that one. We'll get all these numbers later on. We can examine them in a bit more detail. Moving to question 4. In my work, I am mostly comfortable, 1, when following procedures, or 2, when exploring options. So we've talked about those already, so you've got an idea what we're meaning there. So it looks like a larger proportion of people are more interested in exploring options than following procedures, but it's not as clean cut as that. Question 5. Given a choice, I try to A, make sense of issues as an overview, or B, work with detailed sequences. So a lot of people saying, seems to be a large proportion of people saying, I look at this as an overview. I prefer an overview. And then the last question in this Menti section is, when I'm at work, I feel most comfortable with A, things I know about, or B, new and challenging things. So apologies for the speed with which we've rattled through those. This one is quite an interesting split, roughly even, but slight majority of people say I prefer to work with things I know about. So let's leave that there. Okay, so I think we're going to play in now our interview with Shelley. On this webinar, we've been looking at the general theory and application of metaprograms. One very practical application is the development of the lab profile through the book Words That Change Minds. And I'm very pleased that today we welcome the person who wrote the book and has done most to develop it, and that's Shelley Rose Charvet. Shelley, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. And I don't know if everybody knows, but informally, in a self-appointed title, I am the queen of Lab Profile and the Metaprogram. So I just want to let people know you're talking to the queen of
Your Majesty.
Yes.
Shelley, can I ask you firstly to give a brief background of the work that led up to the lab profile being developed and codified, and also what the difference is between the lab profile and personality profiling generally, and why is that useful?
Right. Well, the lab profile, which is actually short for language and behavior profile, came as a development out of the NLP metaprograms. And in the 1980s, Leslie Cameron Bandler noticed and started to codify in a sort of informal system about 60 different patterns that describe how people interact with their environment, what they filter in, what they filter out, and how that affects their behavior. Well, when I first learned metaprograms, I was living and working in Paris, and I was studying NLP, and somebody came from California, naturally, and taught us these 60 different patterns. I was fascinated, but there was no methodology. And Roger Bailey was a student of Leslie's in the 80s, and he's very methodological, and he developed 3 things to make it practical. He developed questions that no matter what the person answers or doesn't answer, you understand what their motivation trigger is and how they think and how they get motivated. Then he also developed influencing language, so that once you know what someone's pattern is, you then have a set of language to use and to avoid using in order to motivate them. And from this, I developed what I call the influencing and persuasion principle, which very simply is, in order to get people to go somewhere with you, you need to meet them where they are and not just pretend they're already where you want them to be. Because what most people do, generically, without even thinking about it, is they use the same strategy that they use to convince themselves about something to convince other people. And then they're kind of shocked and dismayed when other people don't just jump on the bus and come to where they think they are. So imagine you're at your bus stop, you look down at the road at the people you want to convince, persuade, talk to, and you're looking at them and you're saying, "Oi, what are you doing down there? You should be over here." Instead of that, which is what we unconsciously do, if you had a way to go to their psychological bus stop, their motivational bus stop, and from their bus stop invite them onto the bus using language that's meaningful to them, then you could more likely get them on the bus. You can't force them on the bus, but they're more likely to come on the bus. And then you can take them somewhere useful for them and for yourself. So the language and behavior profile is all about that. Now, there's a big difference between personality profiles and the lab profile. Personality profiles are based on how you are, who you are. And there's the big 5, there's many other personality profiles, and this is about you as a person. Well, the lab profile doesn't measure anything about you as a person. It measures how you think, how you get motivated, and how you behave in different contexts. And all of us intuitively know we don't do the same thing 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So the lab profile is different. And just because you have one motivation trigger in one context doesn't mean that you'll have the same in some other context. Work is different than home. Holiday is different than doing grocery shopping. So this kind of tracks what motivates you in different contexts, and there's lots of different applications for it.
Okay, so talking about those applications, I'd like to ask you about two important ones. The first one that comes across in the book very strongly is the suitability or fit of people to do specific jobs using what you call motivation traits and working traits. Can you explain briefly how this works and perhaps give a couple of examples?
Oh, certainly. And recruiting, as well as deciding what kind of career you want, can be based on the kinds of things that motivate you. Now, in the recruitment process, there's a lot of things that have to happen. You need to evaluate candidates against knowledge and skills. And the lab profile, the language and behavior profile, won't help you with that. What it helps you with is fit. Does the person fit the environment, the culture of the organization and the team? And do they fit the job? In terms of what motivates them and how they think. So, for example, some jobs are very goal-oriented. You're supposed to meet these targets, focus on this. Well, you don't want someone who's not motivated by targets. And, you know, we've been talking about in the psychology business for 70 or 80 years that people are better when they have goals. But what we don't talk about is that 40% or more of the population in the context of work is not actually motivated by goals. Some people are motivated to prevent and fix. Hey, give me a problem to solve and I'm in like flint. So how do you measure that? Well, if a job is very goal-oriented, you want people who have what we call the toward trigger. And that means they're motivated only when they have a goal. And once they have a goal, zoom, they're off and running. But that doesn't motivate the people who have what we call an away from pattern. Goals, 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 okay, but give me a problem and I can sink my teeth into it. And we call that away from because what they're doing in their thinking is figuring out how to get away from a problem. And that's either preventing it or fixing it. So if you're an auditor, you need to have an away from problem. If you're a project manager, you need a bit of a combination of both because you've got to aim at that target, but you also need to be able to notice what's likely to go wrong before it goes wrong and then be motivated to jump in and fix it. So toward and away from are really important. And particularly in something like project management, you want someone who has a bit of both. And in the interviewing technique that we use in the lab profile, you listen to the structure of the answer and you can tell how much someone's motivated to move towards a goal and how much they're motivated to move away from problems or fix problems. So that's one of the patterns that's very important in recruiting. There's a number of others as well.
That's really insightful. And the second application of the lab profile that I picked up is about the skillful use of language in order to influence people, something that project folk have to be able to do. This one calls for very strong listening skills as well, doesn't it? Could you give us an insight into that?
Yes. You know, we've always been told we need to listen more. We need to be better listeners. But, you know, in all the learnings about listening, active listening, whatever it is, and active listening, by the way, basically the technique you use is paraphrasing. So I'm listening to you, and then I put into my own words what you just said. But since NLP's been around, we now understand that paraphrasing is less effective than we thought it is because you choose words that are meaningful to you. So if I change them into different words, that doesn't ring the same bell as you. That doesn't resonate as well as with you. So one of the beauties of the lab profile is, what are you going to listen to? Well, the lab profile says, listen for this. So for example, with toward and away from, someone who's in a toward mode talks about goals and targets and benefits. But that's not what someone who's in away from mode talks about. They talk about avoiding, preventing, and fixing problems. They talk about negative consequences. Another pattern that's very important for influencing and persuasion is to understand where and how a person makes a decision in a given context. The people who are hardest to persuade, that we run against all the time, are people who have what we call an internal pattern. That means they decide for themselves based on what their values and their standards are. The thing is, when we're talking to people, they don't say, I'm evaluating what you're saying by XYZ standard. They never tell you. They just sort of sit there and look at you a bit skeptical and disagree with everything. That's how you know they're internal. They are evaluating it for themselves. So the more enthusiastic you are, the worse it is, the more skeptical they become. Think about your spouse. You go home and you say, hey, I had this great idea today. And your spouse goes, oh, yeah, tell me about it. So spouses tend to be very internal to each other, like, you don't tell me what to do. The worst thing is to use command language. You should with somebody who's in internal mode, but it doesn't work. So we talk about internal and we talk about external. When someone's external, they look to the outside for guidance and feedback. Changes by context, of course. But if you want to persuade someone, it's in your best interest, I think, to assume they're internal, and instead of telling them what to do, invite them to decide for themselves. So I want to run this by you, and everybody that's listening, you can think about this and see if that fits, is that if I were to make a suggestion and say, hey, I have an idea, and I'd like to run it by you and find out what you think, how do you think that would fly as opposed to, I've got a great idea, and I think it's going to help you with all your problems? Mm-hmm. Right? One is telling and the other is inviting. And particularly when you have to convince people to do things on your schedule to your deadlines, my suggestion, listen to my language, is to offer some information and invite the other person to decide. And then they get to participate, they get to decide, and they don't have to conform to your dictates. And I suspect, and that's a very good phrase to use, I suspect this might be more effective, particularly when you need them to do something for you. What do you think?
I see that would really work with someone who's internally referenced, because they then are paying back, or they're using their internally referencing process to kind of go along with you, which is quite influencing, isn't it, really? Just to we've talked about a few of the things that you would expect to find in a project environment. And a lot of our audience today are project professionals. They come from various backgrounds, various spectrums of industry and commerce, but all of them in their work will probably encounter deadlines and constraints of time and budget, standards and levels of quality that have to be applied, problems to overcome and decisions to make, teams to harmonize and make them all work well, and also risks to be mitigated. What would your take on it be as to how we would use Lab Profile to recommend something from Lab Profile to help them in their work?
It's a great question, and I think it's even more complicated than you talked about, because today we're working remotely with people from many different cultures. And, you know, I'm here in Hamilton, Canada, and I'm surrounded by many different cultures here. So people who have immigrated here, like in the UK, you have lots of immigrants, but also contractors that you're working with around the world. So, and they have different cultural habits as well as individual motivations and lab profiling. So what do you need to do? Well, one of the ways, and I want you to listen to my language, one of the ways to use Lab Profile is to notice whether you need to have flexibility and options and different approaches, or do you need a standard operating procedure? Now, I've just referred to two of the Lab Profile patterns that I believe are very germane specifically to project management. One is called options, and that is when a person is motivated to color outside the lines, to look at, to have many possibilities. They want flexibility. This kind of person, when they're in this mode, will start a project and be fully committed to it, but then get ideas about other ways to do it. And it's very hard to get someone who's in options mode to meet a deadline. And then you have someone on the other end of the spectrum who has what we call a procedures motivation trigger. And they love to have a step-by-step standard operating procedure. And they don't like to vary from that procedure. And once they've started it, the most motivating thing is to finish it. Well, how do you get these creative options types to work with these more procedural types? And imagine if you only had procedural types trying to figure out projects, or if you only had options types. They need to work with each other. So one of the ways, that's options language, one of the ways, presumes that there's other ways, to work with Lab Profile is to be able to understand these two patterns and be able to speak to both of these people. The logical step-by-step people need to be spoken to in a procedure, not in many options. Like, I'll give you a practical example. Let's say somebody says to you, how do I use this software? If you answer, well, there's lots of ways you can use it, you've lost them already. If they said the word how, what they're asking for unconsciously is a step-by-step procedure, which means you say, first do this, then do this, then do this, and this is the last step on how you use something. So you want to listen to the questions people ask you and the way they talk. If they're talking in options, what's motivating to them is all the possibilities. If they're talking about what's the next step, they're in a process, in a procedure, and they want to know what the step-by-step mechanism is. So if you as a project manager have both of these people in these different modes, being able to interpret between them back and forth. You can say, for example, Tim is on our team and he likes to think about all the different ways to do something. And Shelley wants to know how we're going to get to meet the deadline. So together, although it seems contradictory, they're going to help us meet our deadline and prevent us from missing it or maybe going over budget. Because Tim's going to find some creative solutions to the problems, and then Shelley's going to be great at implementing.
That says to me that a lot of the things that you find in projects is that at different stages of the project, you may need to deploy people with certain characteristics and maybe take them slightly further back. You know, for example, in the option selection process of a project, go for somebody with options characteristics, and then when you've chosen the option, maybe that's the time to look at the procedurization of that single option.
Exactly. And in fact, people who like procedures tend to excel, if they have the requisite knowledge, at implementing, whereas it would bore an options person to death to have to go through a step-by-step implementation process. But if you like implementing, it's gratifying to go through the steps and finish something.
It all sounds scary, but very interesting, which is a good place to be, I think. Thank you, Shelley. Thank you very much for your time today.
And thank you, Tim. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, that was interesting, very, very interesting chat with Shelley there. So now I think we're just going to look at some of the things that she has said, and in the context of Metaprograms, and also look at some of the outputs we got from our audience. So while Shelley was talking there, we got our sort of poll results here, and a couple of interesting ones pop out here, which is that when we asked the question, in general, do you prefer to move towards goals or away from problems? 92% of our audience here said, I work towards goals. I prefer to go towards goals. And only 8% said, we're problem solvers. Any clues on that? Any thoughts? Sophie, Mark?
Yeah, I suppose in some ways it's not a surprise because in the project world, it's all about outcomes and delivering those outcomes. And maybe when it comes to the sort of more the problem solving, actually there are people in our team who can help us with some of that, who can help us work through all the risks and who love a problem. And it's an opportunity then to really bring that person in to help us. Okay,
Mark, any thoughts?
Yeah. It was the one I highlighted as well. It doesn't, like Sophie just said, doesn't surprise me. I think when you're running big projects, you're probably over a longer duration as well, and so therefore there will be lots of different milestones and targets along the way, and it's one way of keeping motivation levels high as you move through the bigger programs. Interesting for people who have that preference when they do come up with or work with people who are away from orientated, not towards, because they're more inclined to set them a target and think that will do the job, and it might not necessarily do so. So that's where the awareness helps in developing your own awareness of your preferences and how you can use that with working with other people to take the friction out of it. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me, that one.
Another one that jumped out at me was when we asked the question, when I work, I prefer to act as soon as possible or to analyse and gather facts and so on. 75% of our audience said, actually, we prefer to wait and analyse before we do anything. Any thoughts on that, either of you?
My take on that is they want to make informed decisions. Again, on projects, there's always consequences if you do something too rationally, and you're not taking all the information in and processing it through. So, doesn't surprise me.
Sophie?
I would just say on that, that just being aware of things like analysis paralysis and when is the right time to take action straight away. I used to work with a colleague, another Scrum Master, and he would just get stuck in straight away, and I would be planning and I'd foresee some of the problems that were going to happen, and he'd encounter them and he'd, of course, redirect and make his way through them, and he'd have all this progress to demonstrate, and he'd have learned things that I never imagined, and I was seeing everything that was going to happen, and I thought, actually, I can learn so much from him. And when is it good for me to just get stuck in? And maybe if I worked in a nuclear environment, I might say no, carry on in my mode. But if I'm working in innovation, where you want to rapidly test things and change things, it's like, how can I take action even sooner?
Another one that some of the answers were sort of split 50-50, but the other one that jumped out a bit was whether people prefer to make sense as an overview or work with detailed sequences. And about 2/3 of the people said that they preferred to see things as an overview rather than working with detailed sequences. Does that surprise either of you at all? Mark?
I think it's more likely that in project management, detailed sequences are going to be left to people in specialisms to work out, and it's really useful to be aware that if you don't have the ability to see the overview, you can get lost, you can miss things. But as Sophie's already mentioned a couple of times as well, it's about having a good mix of people's approaches, because without it, you end up with scotomas. So if everybody's the same, you have a much bigger blind spot as a team. So it's the appreciation, and it's only when you're at the far extremes of these dichotomies, potentially, these continuums, that you potentially will start to have potentially more friction that can occur. And the more we're aware of, my preference is for big picture, and Fred over here is very, very much about detail, but there's a good need for detail, and there's a good need for global, having the big picture. It's in the right context and using those skills and powers.
I suppose that one of the lessons, I suppose, coming out of today is that it pays dividends to as project leaders, to having a better understanding of where our team's individual strengths lie and giving people things to do. For example, if you're asking for someone to lead on option selection, you'd probably try and find someone who's got an open approach to options rather than someone who works through the detail very, very vociferously and gets down to the nitty gritty. Whereas someone who is, for example, working in, say, risk analysis, you might look at someone who's an away from, perhaps, who might say, well, let's just make sure we don't go there, otherwise we won't be able to mitigate that particular risk. But actually, it's helpful to know the bad news in a project, because you really do need to address those square on, as I'm sure we all know. Looking at, as we're in the last 4 minutes or so of this webinar, I put on screen some of the characteristics of metaprograms. Are there any particular characteristics that are on the screen here, or any others really, that either of you would pick out as being something to sort of focus on specifically?
Just picking up on what Shelley was saying about appealing to all of the different types, just thinking about meetings and engagement, and actually how you can hook people, to want to come along to your meetings and to want to participate fully, and just to make sure that people are then fully engaged throughout. So even in your what you send out before, you can think about those people that like time to read it before, the agenda or any documentation, people can reflect. Think about the people who like something new, and actually, so it's not just the same project progress meeting again. Make sure that they know there's going to be something new for them, and the options, people can come up with lots of ideas as well, or maybe a sense of having a section where you're going to generate ideas together and collaborate. So I think it's good, even just at the beginning of a meeting, to sort of make a statement that almost invites in all of those different meta programs so that everyone knows there's something in it for them.
Mark, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's about, first of all, understand what better programs you're running as an individual. Raise your own personal awareness, and that will highlight to you the way you like to do things and the way that feels natural for you. And having an appreciation of how others do it, and it may not necessarily be the same, and working to work together and accommodate those contextually in the right place at the right time increases team performance, reduces any friction and conflict, and gets you the end result, gets you a successful project completed. So that would be my advice.
Excellent. Okay, so we're nearly at the end of the webinar now, and I'll just pop up on here the details where you can get hold of our panel here and their organisations. Mark through Entreplio, Sophie works with Leadership Success. You can get me through the APM. Shelley's details are there as well. Don't worry if this is rather a lot to take in at once. You can find all this information on the recording of the webinar, which will be available through the APM. But if you want to screenshot it now, snap it, that's fine too. I suppose just remains to say thank you very much, Sophie and Mark, for joining today and for helping us get a better understanding of metaprograms and how we can use them in our project environments.
Thank you.
Thank you.